One thing, we still have about 20 minutes left for trade to end. Let's get you some details on what the conversation was that Lata had with the top team at Nomura. Lata caught up with the entire team to get a sense of their take on demonetization and if they expect to see more money moving out of emerging markets. Listen in.
Well, I think to the extent that we have seen the rally or rather sell-off in treasuries, to the extent we have seen, I suspect a lot of it is done, in the sense that we have seen very large outflows, and the US 10-year is at 2.45, largely anticipating the Fed hike, and so I think it's priced in, at least at this point in time. Obviously, India was part of the sell-off, and we had an added sort of concern from some of the investors on demonetization, and that too I think is probably, at least in the near-term impact, sort of people have absorbed that there will be a slowdown. They are seeing that data. There is uncertainty, but I think the bulk of sort of panic reactions are probably over.
What is the view within the emerging market basket? If the sell-off is more or less over, according to you, within the emerging market basket, what is the pecking order?
Well, I can tell you that what we think, and our view on India is still in our regional strategy, is still the preferred market within Asia. So, and largely because despite whatever hiccups you are seeing today, it still remains one of the fastest growing economies. Our reform process continues. We are still looking at acceleration in growth going forward. So hiccups notwithstanding, the overall sort of bird's eye view fundamental picture for India still looks the strongest, amongst the strongest in the economies that we track. And Sonal can probably elaborate on that further from macro perspective, but the strongest growth in GDP and therefore consequently in earnings. So we just take out 2 quarters which are going to be impacted because of the domestic demonetization to sort of go back to faster growth path.
Okay. Sonal, what is the average growth in FY17 and average in FY18?
Well, on an average for GDP growth, we are looking at average growth of around 6.8% in FY17, and FY18 we are looking at a growth number closer to 7.3%.
7.3. Okay, now what does this do to earnings, Prabhat?
So earnings are a bit more interesting, largely because we track, I guess you're talking about headline earnings, yes, index earnings. And my assessment is that it probably cuts the earnings down by 3% and 3 to 4%.
So what were you and where are you?
So this is my expectation on consensus.
Yes.
The expectation of earnings growth was close to 15-16%. I think sort of worst cases comes down by 3-4%. And why I'm saying that is because if you look at the composition of index, 25% is banks, which actually have rallied. PSU banks have rallied post demonetization because of yields coming down. 15% is tech, no impact. 15% oil and gas. Oil prices actually take it up, so that is going up. Metals are 5-6% on the upward trajectory. Pharma is 7%. So you start adding up, you're just left with like 20% or so, which is what you call truly domestic. And out of that, 10% is FMCG. Now that you can argue that there will be some impact in the short term, but FMCG will be the least long-term impact, really speaking. And if the redistribution is something that's happening and we have a good monsoon eventually kicking in, that growth should normalize. You're left with cement 2% and autos about 8-9%. Auto which Tata Motors is 5%. So when you look at truly domestic impact, it's very hard to find earnings impact, which is why the markets are doing what they're doing. Actually, they're not so falling off because the discretionary consumption as we know it has no place or weightage in the index. Because it's all, one is imported. Our cell phones are imported, our white goods are imported. Okay. So we actually don't have companies which have that much weightage. Maybe mid caps will have some impact, but the large caps and index actually don't have that much of earnings weightage from what is sort of slowing down dramatically.